All right. Well, thanks for joining me again as we continue to work through the religious, not spiritual uh, podcast section. I've been talking about how Gnosticism is different than historic religions, and that Christianity is a historic religion, not a Gnostic religion, that it is a religion, not a spirituality. And we summed up Gnosticism as a rejection of the flesh as a good thing, or that we were flung into this flesh as a prison, and that history is not a good thing, but it's part of the problem, part of our prison, and that institutions are automatically suspect because institutions are a part of what we need to be saved from, but that actually, when God in Christ works in the world, he works through his flesh, and that we're saved back into our flesh, that he saved us in history, and that we're saved back into history in a meaningful way. Well, now we're going to start talking about what does it mean that what Jesus saved through the institutions that God established. And so we're going to talk about the three institutions that God established. Um, that God established a priesthood, that God established a kingship, and then we're going to talk about how God established the prophetic ministry as well, but God also established families. So the office of prophet, the is doesn't really fit exactly into an institution, but it's still an office that God develops through time. So we're going to talk about that. But the priesthood, the kingship, and the family that God established, all of those things were things that God used to bring Christ into the world as our Savior, to prepare the world for the salvation that God wrought through Jesus, so that the salvation really is through the institutions that God established. But I want to start by just talking, though, about what priesthood is, what kingship is, what prophecy is, and then we'll talk about the family and the mission that God gave to the family. So first, what does it mean? What is priesthood? I want to start by just talking about the fact that Adam was a priest and what that means that Adam was a priest. Adam's and it becomes central when Paul starts talking about the establishing of the church and the ordering of the church and the ordering especially of the clergy in First Timothy, uh, how to choose pastors, what they're supposed to do. And he does that by talking about the priesthood of Adam, right? That Adam's life as a priest is the model for the current organization of the church. That the church is a restoration back to the intended model the when God was setting up his people, or creating people in the first place in the garden. And sometimes that word priest gets misunderstood because of the different ways that priest is used now. But really, God, it sets up the priesthood. It's a word that God established, and some of the ways that Adam was a priest are evident from First Timothy on. So Adam's priestly job, I mean, from Genesis on, and is used in First Timothy. So Adam's priestly job was to guard and to garden and to oblate, right? And we're going to talk about what that word means in a second. But first, he was supposed to guard. He was supposed to guard and garden the Garden of Eden. So when God created Adam, he created him. He formed him out of the dust of the ground. He blew into him his spirit. He and Adam comes alive, and then God takes him to the Garden of Eden, which so far does not have any plants in it. Right? He takes him into the Garden of Eden, and this is how the story goes. He takes him into the Garden of Eden, and he says, "Let me tell you your job. you're supposed to guard and garden this place. And then he shows him how gardening works because he makes all the plants grow up around Adam, right? So he says, "See, this is a historical process where these plants grow up, and you're going to be in charge of it. You're going to be the one gardening this place, and you're going to have to guard it as well." And then he says, now, back there in the middle of the garden, you've got the two special trees, two set apart trees, sacramental trees, right? One is the tree of life, and the other is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he says, the day you eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die. That is an off limits tree. Do not eat that fruit. And then, as an aside, Genesis tells us now Adam can't actually accomplish that job, right? That it's not good that Adam is alone. Right? He's not going to be able to do that. And then God brings the animals by two and says, "Name these now." And this is a kingly task. We're going to talk about in a priestly in a prophetic task as well. We'll talk about that. But God is teaching Adam that he needs a wife, right? That he needs a queen. But in his priestly role, he's been given this priestly task that he can't accomplish without the help of a woman, right? Without an Eve along with him. But what's really interesting is when he does get his Eve and his job to guard as a priest, his job to guard the garden, the first threat doesn't come against the Garden of Eden. It comes against the Garden of Eve, right? Because there's a deep connection in his work between guarding and gardening and being able to garden the world that God has given and his ability to bring Eve along as his helper, right? To his ability to love her in such a way that she joins his mission, that she submits, which means comes under the mission of another, right? That she takes up Adam's mission that God gave her as her own mission as well. That's what he needs. He needs her and her wisdom to join him to be able to accomplish the task. It's not good that he's alone because he can't do what he's supposed to do. There's other reasons it's not good for him to be alone, but that's one of the most important ones. And so he is supposed to take this Garden of Eden and oblate it, lift it up. Was what the word oblate means. To push it into the space between, right? So to lift it up in between God and mankind, to lift it up into its proper place between man and God, so that these created things can be proper points of grateful fellowship with God, right? So that he's supposed to see the food and say, "Oh, look, God fed us," and this every time we sit down to eat, we're fellowshipping with God because He's given us this gift. That all of the world is seen properly as gifts from God. And so this is why Romans 1, when it's talking about Adam and Eve, or Adam in particular, because he goes on to explain what had happened in the Garden of Eden as the book goes on, works backwards through Abraham back to Adam, but at the beginning he says they refused to give thanks. Right? They weren't taking what God had created and oblating it, lifting it up in thankful, grateful reception as the kind of world, the kind of place, the kind of stuff that makes it possible to have fellowship with one another, right? So you go over to somebody's house and uh, if they lay the food out, and they're out working in the kitchen and getting everything ready, and they put some food on the table, and you run over and you eat the food before they make it to the table, you've actually missed the purpose of the food. The purpose of the food was to be there between you and your host. The purpose was it was a point of fellowship. Well, the whole world in the beginning was created to be those points of fellowship between God and man. And the priestly duty of Adam was to lead the human race in oblating, in lifting up, in taking the created things and letting them, through gratefulness, become points of fellowship between God and man. That's what it means to be made in the image of God. We are the kind of creature that can have fellowship with God, right? There's other aspects to the image of God, but that is one of the central things. We're the kind of creature that can have fellowship with God. And then you'll see that we're the kind of creature that can also represent God to the world. But the that priestly role of oblating. St. Augustine talks about this when he talks about our response to beauty, that we respond to beauty, but the proper response to beauty is for that beauty to become, through grateful reception, that beauty to become he calls it a stream through which we swim up to the beauty of God, right? That God we can enjoy for his own sake, but other things we enjoy as points of fellowship between us and God, as points of revelation of God's beauty. That every stream is of pleasure, of beauty, of good things can be swum up to find the source of all pleasure, the source of all beauty. This is why when Christ is seated at the right hand of God, it says, the Father says, "At my right hand are pleasures forevermore," right? Because he is the source of all good things, the source of all gifts. And so we receive in fellowship, or we receive in gratefulness the world by lifting it up so that it can become a point of fellowship between us and God, right? That's what priests do. That's what Adam's priesthood was all about. But in order for the garden to be oblated, it has to also be guarded, right? It has to be protected. We know that because when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden, we know that there was a gate, right? So God had to bring Adam through the gate of the Garden of Eden after he was made out in the land. He was walked by God through the gate into the Garden of Eden, uh, and then watched it grow up around him. We know that that gate is there because then it's guarded by the cherubim after they're kicked out. And so we have this, the creation of it tells us it needs to be guarded, it needs to be protected, and throughout the rest of the Bible, this image of a guarded garden, of a walled garden, becomes a central image in understanding the role of a husband, and making a place that is safe for people to live in order to be able to be who they were created to be. Well, um, but the reason that it needs to be guarded also is because of the wiles of the devil, right? That the devil was a fallen angel, is seeking to destroy mankind because he hates God, right? He's a murderer from the beginning, and he shows up to murder the image of God because he hates God. He can't get to God, but he can get to God, he thinks, through the destruction of the image of God. Um, that ends up not working out for him in the long run, and because of the priesthood of Jesus. But that priesthood, that guarding aspect of the priesthood, is picked up by Paul in First Timothy when he starts talking about Adam, right? He says Adam was created first, and so he's supposed to be the one leading the worship service, protecting the worship service. He's supposed to be the one preaching. And Eve was created second, and so she's in the Garden of Eden. She was the congregation, and he was the priest. He was the pastor. He was the preacher. And then it says that's why in chapter 3 it says if you're going to hold office in the church, that your family has to be in order, because that husbanding role is very similar, or is the same kind of role that pastoring is, that being a priest in the household of God is, because of that guarding, right? So how have you been guarding and guiding and gardening your family? Is the garden of your family flourishing? Well, the church is going to become like the family of the pastor. That's the direction it's going to move, and so you need to see, is he gardening his family well? And then it goes on to say, and here is the job of a pastor, right? In First Timothy 4, after it talks about the officers being established, and how to wisely find good officers, he starts talking about how uh, the Spirit has told us that the doctrines of devils are coming in, right? That seducing spirits are coming for the church. Now, he's been talking about Adam and Eve, and so it makes sense to think back about the reality of the first time that this happened, right? When the devil came, he came speaking lies in hypocrisy, right? That's what he came doing, which is what it says that is going to happen, is what the officers in the church need to be on the lookout for. And he says this is the doctrine that the demons are going to bring with them: forbidding to marry, commanding us to abstain from food, and that we don't need to receive with thanksgiving um, every created thing of God, which is good, right? To call what God created good, and receive it with thanksgiving, and to sanctify it by the word of God and prayer, right? This is that priestly role of oblation, right? That Adam failed to do. Well, this is what officers in the church are told that they need to accomplish, right? That the doctrine of the devil is going to be touch not, taste not, handle not, marry not. Those things are going to set you apart in the world, and give you authority and perch in the world to be able to do what you're trying to do. Well, actually, that's the lie that the devil used to destroy, to murder the human race, right? He had to get them to eat the fruit so that they could die. So he was a murderer from the beginning. That the dragon that was in the garden in the beginning was a murderer, using words and false doctrines and false humility in order to get them to die, right? In order to murder them. Um, but now we're dead in with Christ from the rudiments of the world, and so we're no longer subject to the ordinances that brought about our death from the beginning. So that is the priesthood of Adam: guard, garden, and oblate. Now, the priesthood of Christ, we're told that if you've been reading the Substack, I've been working through the genealogies to show that Jesus is the rightful descendancy of Adam, right? That he is the Garden King's descendant, but he's also a priest after the order of Melchizedek, because of the way that David interacted with Melchizedek. So I've got those things written down. If you want to go read more in detail and see the actual verses that work it through, Jesus is a priest after the order of Melchizedek because David uh, attached or integrated the throne of Melchizedek in Salem into the Davidic throne, when right after the tribes all uh, submitted themselves to him as king, that he moved his throne to the city of David, to Jerusalem, which means was Jerusalem, which means the peace of God, right? So the city, which was called Salem, becomes Jerusalem, and David centers his throne there. Well, that throne is Melchizedek's throne. So he combines those things together in order to become a priest king after the order of Melchizedek, and Hebrews talks about how important that is. So, but Jesus takes on these priesthoods, right? He takes on the priesthood of Adam. He takes on the priesthood of Melchizedek. He takes on these priesthoods in a legal way, in an institutional way, because God saves through institutions. God is not suspicious of institutions the way Gnostics are. We shouldn't be suspicious of institutions the way Gnostics are. Institutions are either being run by faith or they're not being run by faith, right? They're either trusting in Jesus or they're not trusting in Jesus. But institutions aren't the problem, right? Institutions aren't a distance that are created between us and God. God actually uses institutions to draw us close to him. And so That's the first one, is the priesthood. And tomorrow we will talk about the what kingship is, and what it means that Jesus is king, by looking at Adam as a garden king and what his job was there. So, all right. Thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.